Hello there. In this video, I will show you how to create a EKS cluster and configure it to work with Ingress controller. I'll make use of AWS Load Balancer controller and VPC CNI to make best use of Ingress controller. Link to the code will be available in the gist. So first of all, why do I need a load balancer controller when I'm configuring a Ingress controller? You don't need it. You can configure the Ingress controller without having the load balancer controller. However, when you configure the Ingress controller without the load balancer controller, what will happen is you will get a target group type of node port, which is not ideal. So with the load balancer controller, you will be able to create a NLB that will have a target type of IP. So this is the setup I'm trying to install. I will have a VPC and I'll have a public subnet and private subnet. My nodes will be in the private subnet and there'll be ingress controller load balancing all the traffic for me. So if you look in the Terraform code, I've already configured the EKS and I've already installed the EKS. The main configuration to look into is EKS add-ons. So you need to install the VPC CNI plugin that is necessary for load balancer to be able to use the target port of IP. So you need to enable the prefix delegation. And also for configuring the load balancer controller, you need a specific IAM permission. And also here I am using IAM RSA. So you also need to specify the service account you will be using. And you need to map this service account to the load balancer controller installation. So this load balancer controller will have an IAM policy, IAM role, and some additional permission for creating and managing the load balancer. And here is a Helm chart for load balancer controller. I'm passing few parameters. One of the main important thing is you need to pass the service account annotation so that this should match the service account you're creating in the IAM RSA. So we are ready to go, and I will go ahead and apply the Terraform code. I've completed the creation of EKS cluster and the installation of AWS Load Balancer. You can see there is AWS Load Balancer controller and there's AWS node port. You must always install the load balancer controller before creating the Ingress controller app. Now we are ready to install the Ingress controller. So if you look at the Ingress app configuration, here you will see there is a full name override. I'm just passing it as ingress-Nginx. I will be installing it in the namespace ingress-Nginx. Ingress class, this is what I'm calling it as Nginx external because I plan to use it for the external traffic than internal. And here are some configurations I'm using and using forward headers because I'm using AWS load balancer. So X forwarded for headers must be forwarded and forcing SSL redirect. In this case, I'm not doing it. It'll be good to have always redirect traffic to the SSL, enable real IP monitoring so that you can see the IP address of the source in your logs. And there are a couple of annotations. One of the main annotation is saying creating the load balancer, you should create an internet facing. If you do not specify this one, by default, the Ingress load balancer created will be internal. I'm also defining the target type as IP and also configuring to preserve the client IP so that we can see the true IP address in the logs. So if you have a default certificate, you can always enable that. It's always a good idea to have a default certificate. So any URL that does not have any certificate, you can always get a default one. I have configured the auto scaling group and also defined some resources. Default backend is another port. If you want to, you can enable it for any request that does not have a valid host name configured in the Ingress controller. So I have the cluster installed and configured. Also, I have the kubectl configured, kubeclient configured, and load balancer controller installed. So now I'm ready to install the Ingress controller. I'll go ahead and install the Ingress app with the value specified. So you can see the Ingress is getting created and we're waiting for the creation to complete. Okay, so you can see there's created a load balancer type, service type, and the external IP of the load balancer. So we have an Ingress controller up and ready, and we have an external DNS also for the load balancer controller. Let's have a look in the console and verify. So if you go to the load balancer controller, and you will see there's a load balancer controller, and it does have a target group, which is forwarding to 40 and 80. So this is actually forwarding to the port rather than node port. So if you look at the target groups, if you look at the target, you can see it is 443 and 80. This is possible because we have the load balancer controller. So we are using the target type of IP. Now we are ready to test our application. So let's install an application and verify if it works. So let's have it go back to the code. I have a sample application here, so I'm going to apply that. the echo server. So I'm just deploying an application, and it also has an ingress configured. So let's have a look and wait, and you can see the application is running. And if you go to the ingress and look at the ingress, here you can see there is a echo server namespace, and there's a ingress with the class Nginx external, and there's a host name, and this is mapping to the same network load balancer that is provisioned by the ingress controller. So since I don't have any DNS, I will not be able to test it directly. So what I'll do is I'll use the curl command to test it. So in the curl command, I already set the ALB URL variable that is the same as this, and also I'm passing the host name in the host header. Okay, there you go, it works. And if you go into the ports and look at the load balancer logs, so you can see here the load balancer requests are coming in. Okay, also notice I have the source IP. This is not the internal IP, this is the actual IP address I'm sending the request from. So that's it. You have a working ingress-Nginx. You're ready to deploy new apps, and all the apps can share the same network load balancer. And if you install any certificate, you can use it with the load ingress controller, and also you have the advantage of using potentially certificate manager for managing your certificate automatically, so that whenever there's a new ingress created, certificate manager will issue a new certificate. Thank you very much, and I hope you find this information useful.